It is my honor to present our speaker, Dr. Teresa Betancourt. I have to read because she's done so much. Dr. Betancourt is the director of the research program on children and global adversity at Harvard University and an associate professor of child health and human rights at Harvard University School of Public Health. She did her undergraduate work at Linfield University in Oregon in psychology, got a master's degree in visual arts or expressive arts therapy from the University of Louisville, who we had a speaker from, and then her PhD in child and maternal health from Harvard University, where she's presently located. She has an extensive research background and publication background, which would take me all day to recite up here. But her practice and research is focused on the developmental and social consequences of concentrated adversity on children and families. Resilience, protective processes on child and adolescent mental health, refugee families, and applied cultural mental health research. She is the principal investigator of some stuff that I'm really excited about, which is a longitudinal study on war-affected youth in Sierra Leone, and is also evaluating the impact on family strengthening and interventions for HIV, is also evaluating that on HIV-affected children and families in Rwanda. Her most recent research project, which she tells me is not reflected on the website necessarily, are three things. She's got a National Institute of Mental Health funded project called Youth Forward, which is providing global mental health services research and providing for a hub for that to happen in Western Africa. Working on a program called Prevention Spectrum, which is looking at violence and its effects, and also a family strengthening program initiative, which is working with families in Rwanda and also refugee families and children in the Boston area from Somalia. Okay, I hope I got that all right. Okay, Dr. Teresa Betancourt.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Elaine. Thank you, everyone, for the warm welcome. I've really enjoyed participating in this conference and have learned a lot. And I have to say, I was really struck by the quality of the presentations today and just the terrific work to see happening here in Colorado. I think as someone who's originally from Alaska and identifies with the West Coast, it's fun to come out here and see how global the vision is and the impact. So it's really my honor to be here, and I want to thank you. So I'm going to be talking today about a project that's really been a labor of love. This has been a project of 14 years of work in Sierra Leone, West Africa. And I'm going to talk a little bit about trauma and mental health in the lives of youth and moving towards economic development, but also development of more peaceful opportunities for young people in post-conflict Sierra Leone. So I'd like to give you a little bit of background on our research program on children and global adversity, what are some of the conceptual drivers behind that program, and then I'll get into some of our mixed methods research, looking at observational studies, qualitative research, formative research early on, and then moving into testing interventions, but then not stopping there with just the randomized control trials of do these interventions work, but thinking about how do we go to scale? And how do we sustain these sorts of programs and get the development actors to invest in them? And that's really been a question that's galvanized my thinking over the last few years, and some of the work I'm now trying to do that we'd put more into the vein of implementation science and global mental health. And then I'd like to close in discussing implications of efforts like this for peace and development and some of the next steps our team's pursuing. So you heard from Elaine that I direct a research program on children and global adversity. And what we're trying to do in that program is to identify factors that contribute to risk and to resilience in children, families, and communities that face adversity globally. And I'll tell you a little bit more of how we think about adversity. But it's important to note that this is a focus on capacities and on strengths and not just a deficits orientation, which I think is very important when working with communities affected by trauma. And that what we're trying to do is contribute to a better global evidence base on intervention strategies. There's a tremendous gap between what we know about promoting child development, addressing trauma, from tremendous research done around the world, but then when you look at what's done what programs are on the ground in very poor countries, conflict-affected countries, the quality of what's happening is actually very low. Why is that? And how do we bridge that gap better between what we know and what is actually done on the ground, and support the development of high quality and effective services that can be scaled and that can be sustained over time? And so being at a place like Harvard, I've been able to be inspired by some great minds out there in terms of child development and child mental health thinking. It was really my pleasure to know Julius Richmond, who's a former U.S. Surgeon General and really the mastermind behind the scale-up of the Head Start program nationally here in the U.S. And Julius Richmond writes very cogently about this link between the evidence base and its role in galvanizing political will and helping to enact improved public policy. And so those of us in the research community have a very important role to play in providing that evidence base that can then feed social strategies to enact policy change. And that's something that I see as a very important role for us to play as university actors. Now, when I mention adversity, I'm really speaking about exceptions to recent improvements in child health around the world. So if you look at global statistics in terms of infant mortality, maternal mortality, other health indicators, we're seeing that child health globally is improving. Which is good news, especially for those of us in public health. But there are two big exceptions to these improvements, and those are regions with a high burden of violence and armed conflict, and regions with a high burden of HIV and AIDS. And in those settings, we see the trend is going another way. In some places like Rwanda, where you heard a little bit that I also work, we actually see these two vectors of risk coexisting. So these are really important areas to think about in terms of what is the nature of child development and mental health, and how can we contribute to improved evidence-based practices. So you heard a little bit from Elaine about what my team's been up to. We've had this long-standing body of work on children in armed conflict, children affected by communal violence. It started with very early work on the Kosovar displacement, work on Chechen IDP youth, and then work with the International Rescue Committee on the Ethiopia-Eritrea border. We were privileged to work with the IRC again in northern Uganda on the topic of child soldiers, and then also a number of other partners, including War Child Holland and World Vision. And also very fortunate to have this opportunity in collaboration with the International Rescue Committee to work in Sierra Leone at the end of the civil war there. And that's what I'm going to focus my talk on today, is that body of work. We are very interested in thinking about interventions that sort of run across that spectrum, from mental health intervention for trauma-exposed populations, but also prevention. And my team's been doing a lot of work recently around family home visiting, family strengthening interventions. We started this work in the context of HIV in Rwanda, and now we're focused on working with the government and the World Bank around families living in extreme poverty, and the poverty reduction strategy there in Rwanda as a platform for bringing home visiting programs to very impoverished families. And then also we're doing family-based prevention work with refugees in the Boston area. And I was so excited to hear your presentation today and invite you to come and spend some time with us, because we are looking at models run by refugees for refugees to really help new families navigate their lives in resettlement, and starting first with Bhutanese and Somali Bantu refugees. And this is community-based participatory research. And you'll see that sort of CBPR tendencies along the spectrum of CBPR in a lot of our work. So in working in diverse cultures, and I'm originally from Alaska, I was just talking at our table about growing up in an indigenous community that was mainly Yupik Native Alaskans, gave me tremendous respect for other cultures, other worldviews, languages, and cultures to which I was sort of a witness, but very much realized my outsider status too. But to approach and work in these areas and work in new cultures and communities, you have to work in partnership. And you have to be good at listening and really understanding how even these concepts we may be interested in, mental health, child development, parenting, how are they conceptualized locally? What about resilience, protective processes, social support? What does that look like in this culture and setting? And because of those interests, it's made me a mixed methods researcher. I don't rely just on the quantitative, but we always start with a very robust qualitative focus to understand these constructs in new settings to which we are ultimately outsiders in partnership with locals. And then once we have some formative work on how these constructs are identified, identified how they're conceptualized locally, we can use that information to select, to adapt, or even create measures. We also spend a lot of time understanding protective processes and what contributes to resilience in a new setting, and that gives us a chance to think about strengths-based models. How do we think about the naturally occurring protective processes that we can leverage in bringing an intervention model to this setting? Wherever possible, we try to conduct validation studies of our measures to make sure they're doing the work we hope they're doing. And then in this third phase of our model, we can come back and implement the culturally informed intervention and evaluate it using the culturally informed assessments and use the most rigorous designs possible, including randomized control trials and now implementation science, even much bigger scale-up studies. And this has really been a process we've repeated across many of the different cultural contexts that I told you about in the work we've been doing on the team. So to turn to the topic of children in armed conflict, and this is something that I've been working on for a long time, and these statistics get argued about depending on if you're talking about current conflicts or ongoing unsolved conflicts or post-conflict settings. But some estimates from UNICEF would say that there are about 1 billion children who live in countries affected by armed conflict. This is not a side issue. This is a tremendously important issue when you think about the world's population and the fragility of so many young lives around the world. Just to look at the situation of refugees, globally there were 19.5 million refugees and an estimated 38.2 million internally displaced people at the end of 2014. 51% of these under the age of 18, so these are definitely issues in the lives of children and youth and tremendously important issues. And so what's happening is also that the nature of war itself is changing. We're seeing an increase in conflicts that involve non-state actors, militia groups, rebel groups, terrorist organizations who have little regard for conventions about the protection of civilians in situations of armed conflict. There's an often quoted statistic that it used to be in the Great Wars, World War I, World War II, you'd have 1 civilian injured for every 9 soldiers, but it's now flipped, that we see many more civilians injured and killed compared to formal military actors. And what's also happening in today's conflicts is these are wars of destabilization. So communities are targeted, schools are targeted, hospitals are targeted. The fabric of day-to-day life is the target. It's in the center of the conflict. And this has implications for the life survival of children and families, but also the trajectories of development that they're set upon in their lives. What's their opportunity to return to school? What will be their opportunities to pursue a livelihood, to achieve economic self-sufficiency? That the nature of war today undermines so many elements of the fabric of day-to-day life, and it's tremendously important to be thinking about the social ecology around the young person. So to talk about mental health and war-affected youth, we know that the global burden of mental disorders due to violence and conflict is substantial. I don't need to tell you those statistics, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, where the impact of war has been disproportionate. And that children exposed to war, we know from so many studies, suffer from high rates of traumatic stress reactions, depression, anxiety, high-risk behaviors. If you just take the situation of child soldiers alone in northern Uganda, there have been a number of studies now. We see rates of PTSD on standard measures, and again, do we all have the time to do the validation work? But ranging anywhere from 27 to 35% meeting standard criteria for PTSD. A colleague of mine, Brandon Court, who works in Nepal, found that with former child soldiers there, about 55% met criteria, and Brandon does very thorough work on validation. But in this research, we're still looking at some tremendous areas where we don't know a lot. And a lot of the research to date in war-affected settings on children is this sort of classic combination of how much traumatic sort of exposure does a young person have and then how much psychopathology. And those are important studies to do, but we have to push beyond that to also think about child development, which is something that occurs over a process of time. And we have very few longitudinal studies that really look at what does this mean for the impact on a young person's lives as they develop into adulthood, and what are the opportunities to think about different types of intervention more from a life course perspective. And because we have this focus on the sort of how much trauma, how much psychopathology, we don't do a lot of work looking at the post-conflict environment. And I think there were some very interesting discussions, especially in the refugee and migrant panel earlier today, about how traumatizing that post-resettlement environment can be. And so we need more research of that nature as well. And we don't have a lot of intervention studies. We've just done a recent systematic review of the common elements of evidence-based interventions for war-affected youth. And I think that pulled about 28 studies together. And we began to distill out what are the common practices that are being used in these models that are thought to be effective. And I'll talk a little bit more about the need for trans-diagnostic models in this field, because in war-affected settings, there's a lot of comorbidity. Children don't just present with pure depression or pure traumatic stress reactions. We have to think about ways that we can think about many different problem and symptom domains and impairments at once. So I don't need to tell this group that we need to think about developmentally informed and longitudinal research from an ecological perspective, taking from the early work of Urie Bronfenbrenner. We know that any one child's mental health or developmental outcomes are the result of course, individual factors, age, gender, temperament, intelligence. We also then have to think about the family. Who's available to that young person? What's the nature of caregiver mental health, of family resources, of conflict, of opportunities for caregivers? And then we have to think about community level factors. In so many of these collectivist cultures, who else is important in that young person's life? Are there mentors? Are there coaches? Are there teachers? What's the nature of extended networks in the community? How about access to education, access to other life opportunities? And then we have to also take into account the societal level, the political and the historical context that's often behind the war itself and the underpinnings, and also how in that cultural perspective people think about issues such as reconciliation and coexistence, peace and healing. That all of these layers are coming together to influence any one child's mental health over time. Now, to talk about Sierra Leone and the study there, of course, this is not just my work. This takes a tremendous team of collaborators to do work of this nature. Colleagues, postdocs, trainees at Harvard University, our collaborators at City University of New York, my tremendous collaborator, Adeyinka Akinsolori-Smith, who's originally from Sierra Leone and a clinical psychologist and helped me develop and implement these models in the field when it comes to intervention. And then I'll talk a little bit more about our colleagues at the University of Georgia. And then in Sierra Leone, we have this tremendous team. I've been there 14 years. I have some people who've been working with me all that time. Moses Sambo, who helped us start the study. And tremendous intervention staff as well, who have had jobs at different NGOs, but those really haven't been able to be sustained in terms of professional path over time. And I have to acknowledge our funding support for the intergenerational study from the National Institutes of Child Health and Development, and now the new research hub from NIMH. So it used to be when I would give a talk about Sierra Leone, people had never heard of it. Unfortunately, due to the Ebola outbreak, now people have heard of Sierra Leone. It's been very much in the news. This is a really teeny country on the coast of West Africa, neighboring Liberia, Guinea, and Cote d'Ivoire. And if you're somebody who's interested in adversity and resilience, unfortunately, Sierra Leone offers a lot of opportunities to understand and explore the meaning behind so much of that. Sierra Leone has about 6 million people. 38% of the population lives in urban areas. Median age of Sierra Leone is 19. So we're talking about a country, when you talk about demographics and a youth bulge, a country where a lot of your population are young people. Life expectancy in Sierra Leone is still in the late 40s and has some of the highest rates of infant mortality and maternal mortality on Earth. And these should have been canary in the mine sort of issues to reveal that the health system was not prepared for an outbreak like Ebola. Sierra Leone for many years has been vying for the bottom of the UN Human Development Index, very high rates of youth unemployment, low literacy, especially in women. Now with the Ebola outbreak, the country experienced more than 8,700 confirmed cases of Ebola virus disease. There were nearly 4,000 deaths and massive health system strain, if not collapse. So come into this situation and think about trying to advance mental health as a health issue when you've just had this tremendous collapse of the health system due to Ebola, and why the health system was so weakened in so many ways. Certainly issues of governance and corruption, but also a failure to recover from the civil war, which lasted in Sierra Leone from 1991 to 2002. I've worked in northern Uganda, as I mentioned. It was the case during the war in northern Uganda that you could sit at an internet cafe in Kampala and happily have your cappuccino, and there'd be a war raging in the north and you wouldn't even know it. That's not the case in Freetown, Sierra Leone. The war came to the capital. A massive amount of population displacement was experienced by people living in Sierra Leone during the war. If you saw the movie Blood Diamond, you saw a Hollywood portrayal of the tragedy in Sierra Leone. This war was sort of infamous for the involvement of children in armed forces and armed groups. It's estimated that upwards of 20,000 children were abducted into different fighting forces. The Civilian Defense Forces, which were locally organized sort of militias, the Sierra Leone Army, and then most infamously, the Revolutionary United Front, or RUF rebel group. At the end of the war, only about 4,600 children were formally demobilized. So what that means is in Sierra Leone, you had a lot of young people who went home to their families and communities without any formal supports. Another feature of the involvement of children in the conflict in Sierra Leone were deliberate attempts, especially by the RUF, to sever ties between young people and their communities. So upon raiding a village, they'd line children up, they'd force them to commit atrocities against the person standing next to them or against elders or other people in the community, with the idea being that they would break this tie, that those kids could never run away and be accepted back home. But the reality was, at the end of the war, you had thousands of young people coming out of fighting forces, and there was a big policy debate about what's in their best interest. Can we just house these kids in orphanages or place them in foster care? Or, if at all possible, should they go home to their families and communities? And that's when our study started, was right around that period of reintegration. So this is a painting of an interim care center in Kono, Sierra Leone. That's the diamond mining region that was sort of the headquarter of a lot of the activity for the land grabs that were behind controlling the diamond mining industry. And this was run by the International Rescue Committee. I've spent time at that interim care center, and I love this painting because I remember when I'd go to that center, the kids were sleeping on, threadbare mats, and it was really shot up and dingy in the place. But look at this painting. It's a place of peace, it's beautiful, it's, children are playing in the yard. It tells you a lot about the experience of this young person and how they experienced that center and what they were able to get there. And so what they would provide at these centers is children would come out very traumatized, in great medical need, malnourished. So they would tend to those very basic needs, food, shelter, medical care, but also start to engage children in activities. So you see here a soccer game underway, basic numeracy and literacy activities. They had local counselors who would develop relationships with the kids, build trust. And then once a young person could open up and tell their story, they would engage in what was called a tracing interview. And so they'd have the young person talk about where they came from, who they'd last been with, who they knew might still be around, what were their thoughts about going home. And then armed with that information, a social worker would go out to people identified in the tracing interview, go back to those communities to see if they could make the link. Could they find that family? Could they find that community? And sometimes they'd use video testimonials, really thoughtful work about helping those young people explore the possibility of going home. Another very important part of this were community sensitization campaigns that were being held by the government and by NGOs to bring together people in the community, like a town hall style discussion, and have elders there, have other youth, have parents there, and talk about the fact that there have been numbers of children from this region found, what were the attitudes about their ability to come home. And it was a way to open up a dialogue, but also to take the temperature of that community to say, is there a readiness here to accept these young people back home? And if it was determined that it was possible, then they would make the link and the child would be returned to some sort of home configuration. I think where the international community really fell down in these efforts is after all this thoughtful work to get young people placed back home, they then turned that over to a voluntary structure that wasn't supported, wasn't professionalized, wasn't trained, and had no funding. So, child welfare committees that were voluntary mechanisms were supposed to now manage it after the handoff. We did some research on that and found that a lot of them had fallen apart. And when you had a charismatic charismatic leader who really cared and who could do it in addition to their 10 other jobs and raising their family, they would persist, but most of them fell apart. So we've been in a very interesting ethical dynamic in this research. We're the only ones who come back and check on these young people over time. So I'll tell you a little bit about the study. But we saw this as a really important time to understand from a longitudinal perspective, what is it that helps to shape more resilient pathways of child development, psychosocial adjustment, and community reintegration, or more risky paths, and to have it sort of take on that ecological model and to be informative, we hope, to programs and to policies moving forward. And so it's always been a mixed method study involving deep dive qualitative interviews as well as repeat surveys over time from more of a quantitative perspective with caregivers and with the young people themselves as we got more resources to do both. And we had to think a great deal about how to ground this in the local cultural context through having meetings with elders, key stakeholders, focus groups about constructs and qualitative data collection, and then the ethics of doing this work. You know, you can't just go around saying, we're doing a study of former child soldiers, do you know where this person is? You can't do that. So we had to think very thoughtfully about how we were perceived in the community and how we conducted this work in terms of protecting the identity of people and being sensitive, and then risk of harm issues. So when we first started the study, there were pretty robust services. The NGOs were getting funding to help young people like this. As we continued this longitudinal study, we watched the mental health services and the social services evaporate. And so it's taken us more and more time with every wave of data collection to do that legwork to figure out who are the service providers for referrals out here, because we know we will always encounter those cases of violence, of suicidality, of unmet needs of many sorts, and we have to, ethical obligation to anticipate those and think about how to handle them as a research team. So just to summarize the sample, if we could find everyone, we've been following a cohort of 529 young people. A third of them are females. And we got our main sample at baseline from that same interim care center that I just showed you the painting of. It was serving 5 districts in Sierra Leone. And we then went door to door, again with this ethics issue, thinking about how could we have a comparison group that weren't former child soldiers. So we couldn't really say who was a child soldier or not. So we had our kids who were being served by the center, which everyone knew you had to be a former child soldier to go through that. So we asked for kids who hadn't gone through these kinds of centers. Well, you saw the reintegration, self-reintegration rates in the country. We got a lot of self-reintegrated former child soldiers. We just didn't know that until we started to look at their data. And we realized that given the way that the war had moved around the country, it was going to be really hard to find kids who weren't somehow affected or involved in one of those fighting forces. So to make lemonade out of lemons, we then said we're going to re-enroll a cohort of self-reintegrated youth, so we have sizable numbers of both, and then follow them all over time. And so there are only about 36 to 40 young people who have no involvement with an armed group in our sample. It's mainly former child soldiers, either got a formal center or not. But because this isn't randomized to getting the center, it's not really a great test of those services either. It's an observational study. In wave 2, we had added in, so we started in 2002. The young people were 10 to 17 when we were enrolling them. At time 2 in 2004, as we were finishing that new sample of self-reintegrated youth in McKinney and moving back to Kono, the diamond mining region, there was a helicopter crash that killed the IRC's country director, killed a lot of other humanitarian staff, and it was a horrible tragedy in Sierra Leone, so we suspended the study. In time 3, armed with the advent of cell phones and more research funding, we came back and were able to find even more of our sample than we had at time 2 because we had stopped. And so we have this very interesting, I've become quite expert in multiple imputation in dealing with missing data because you actually have more people missing at time 2 than time 3. But over time, we've been able to retain about 70% of the sample. And now we're in time 4, which I'll mention briefly, and we're still able to retain a lot of the sample. And it's a testament to our amazing staff and how ethical they are when they work in these communities. In terms of the measures, we're spanning across that social ecology, so we're looking at basic demographics, of course. We were able to build on the work of the Refugee Studies Program at Oxford University and their measure of psychosocial adjustment. And why I like this measure, they had pulled it from common items that you might see on like the Achenbach child behavior checklist, but they had done the community work to say, do these certain behaviors or indicators sort kids who are doing well from those who are not? And then they'd administered it to a sample both in northern Uganda and Sierra Leone. And it has subscales for depression-like problems, anxiety, hostility, but also the positive side of youth development, pro-social attitudes and behaviors, and confidence. And so you'll see us sort of putting these together into internalizing, externalizing, or pro-social. We built on the work done by Larry Aber and others from the Columbia War Trauma Questionnaire to look at different experiences in the war. So we have subscales for deprivation, witnessing, victimization, and perpetration, which is important in this sample. And then from our qualitative work, we were able to look at what are indicators of being accepted back into the community and adapted to the scale of perceived discrimination that's been used in work on racial and ethnic disparities in a number of different cultural settings from David Williams, the Everyday Discrimination Scale. And there was a lot of pushback about putting standard mental health measures into this study from the UN and other NGO actors. At time 2, we did add some standard measures for depression, for anxiety, and PTSD, the Hopkins Symptom Checklist, and the PTSD-RI. And then as our sample's been getting older over time, we've been looking at questions of, are they finishing school? Are they pursuing a livelihood? Do they have intimate partners? Are they starting a family? And we realized that a lot of our sample were actually starting to become parents. And that's when we wrote the most recent grant to NICHD for an intergenerational study. There's not really been the opportunity to do that from a perspective approach design-wise. And so it's really been our honor to do that. So right now, time 4 is underway. Post-Ebola, we were a little held up by that. But our staff are amazing. So they're now re-enrolling the whole cohort, their intimate partners, and their children. And so that's underway, and we're still, things are looking good in terms of our retention. So I want to just go back to talk a little bit about toxic stress and complex trauma. So this is a paper we published in Child Development just on the sample of known former child soldiers who went through that center in Kono. If you look at violence and trauma in that sample, it's pretty staggering. This is in 259 young people. Average age of abduction was 10 years on average. Average length of time with the fighting forces was just over 4 years. So you're taken from your family, and you're being socialized by an armed group in absence of all those social connections for 4 years on average. Just imagine what you know about trauma and child development, what that means. And then when we looked at violence exposures by males and females, we found very similar rates of being involved in frontline fighting, reconnaissance missions, but when it came to sexual violence, off the charts for females at 45%, but also 5% of males. And that's probably underreported. And these are repeat experiences. These aren't one-time experiences. And more than a quarter of our sample reported having killed or injured others. So being involved in mass atrocities, being involved in violent events affecting others. And 50% of the former Revolutionary United Front rebels reported being forced to use drugs or alcohol. And this is a painting by that same amazing artist in Sierra Leone that shows a picture of the rebels preparing to raid a village, sort of getting hopped up on drugs and alcohol. And they used to rub gunpowder into wounds they'd cut into the arms of children and tell them it would make them sort of omnipotent, that they'd be able to outrun bullets, and all kinds of horrible substances that kids were forced to take to inure them to the violence. So these are growth models because in this analysis, and this was published in the Journal of the American Academy of Child Analysis and Psychiatry, we've got 3 waves of data here. So we can look at change over time. So these are growth models. The upper part of the chart are predictors of where you start on that outcome, and the bottom segment are predictors of your change over time. And we see for an outcome like internalizing anxiety and depression, that young people started at higher levels of depression-like problems and anxiety-like problems if they were longer with the armed group, if they had experienced sexual violence, but also the post-conflict factors start to come in right away. If they came back to stigma, it predicts starting out already at a higher level. And we saw increases in internalizing over time for those who were young when they were first involved with the armed group, but also the post-conflict environment is here again, those who came back to experience daily hardships. And this is housing insecurity, food insecurity, just the basics of life not being there for you. There are some protective factors. They don't totally offset these dynamics, but they're important. So we saw higher community acceptance at baseline had a partial mitigating effect, and when community acceptance improves over time, that's also important. So you're sort of seeing stigma and community acceptance working off of each other. Now, for externalizing, people get very focused on this outcome when thinking of former child soldiers, or these are some of the stigmatizing attitudes. Are these young people going to be little killers? Are they going to be, tainted with rebel blood? These are problems with hostility and anger and emotion regulation. And we see that young people start at higher levels of externalizing problems if they come back to stigma. So again, the post-conflict environment is really setting the tone in a lot of ways. But we do see a trend towards increased problems in this area if young people were involved in killing or injuring others. And protective factors, again, relate to increases in community acceptance. Now, adaptive and pro-social behavior is actually a really important outcome when it comes to young people who've been through experiences like this. That ability to engage with others, to be seen as being a part of a collectivist culture, as participating in communal activities, really matters. And in fact, I'll tell you a little bit qualitatively in one of our case vignettes about what that looks like in a young person's life. But the young people came back and they were provoked and taunted and teased. They were called little killers. How they navigated that provoking really mattered. And having these interpersonal abilities, pro-social skills really mattered. And we saw that young people who started at higher levels of adaptive and pro-social behavior and attitudes were those who had more access to school, who started at higher levels of community acceptance. And then we see deficits in this ability in those who injured and killed others and those who experienced stigma. A lot more sticks to this in terms of protective factors. Increases in community acceptance has a role to play, as does staying in school, as does social support. So you start to think about, okay, what's leverageable? We can't go back and undo those horrific war experiences that young people had, but there's a lot here that is leverageable that the post-conflict programs and policies can be thinking about. So it's one thing to show you growth models, but also I think useful to talk about a case study. This is a vignette of a young person in our study. This is not his real name, but I'll call him Sar. When we last interviewed Sar, he was 17 years old and living in the rural areas of Sierra Leone in the provinces. He'd been abducted at the age of 7. Sar was out in the forest collecting firewood with his grandmother when the rebels surrounded them. And they said they were taking the boy. And the grandmother pleaded, why would you take a 7-year-old boy? And they said they were taking him to be the houseboy of the wife of a rebel commander. But as you see here from Sar's interviews and surveys, we know that he was exposed to so much more over those 4 years with the RUF rebels. He witnessed countless massacres, bombings, amputations, shootings. He was often tasked with spying and information gathering. He'd be sent ahead to check on a village before the rebels raided it. He was forced to take drugs by the RUF. And after the war, they had a very hard time reuniting Sar with his family. And some of what we think was going on is when we interviewed the mother, she said how she had suffered from what she called poil-at, which in the Creole language, your heart can poil. It's about your heart spoiling, which is a local term for depression-like problems. And so she'd been unable to advocate for the return of her son. And another important dynamic in Sar's family was his father had died, and now the mother was living with the uncle who was head of household. But immediately there were issues because this uncle saw Sar as problematic, shameful. He was rejecting of the boy. And when the most powerful person in the family, you think about that social ecology, when the most powerful person in the family is not in your corner, that's when so many young people start to not look good in terms of their outcomes over time, when they don't have that family support and advocacy and guidance. Sar had a loving mother and grandmother. In their interviews, they say he came back to us because he loved us, but the mother struggled with mental health problems. And Sar started to have difficulties with the community. So people would taunt and tease him, call him rebel boy, and he would fight back. And on a number of occasions, they then beat him, saying they were correcting his behavior. The mother would come. She has this very poignant interview where she said, I didn't see the purpose of beating a boy in the name of correcting him. But she was powerless because this uncle saw the boy as shameful and didn't advocate for him in the community. So over time, there were a number of these blowouts with the community. On one occasion, Sar pulled a knife on people. After that, it was like he was blamed for every crime that happened, any stealing, any crime in the village. When we last interviewed Sar, he was living on the outskirts of another town. He had dropped out of school. He'd left his family. And he was living and working just for a place to stay and some food. He wasn't even making a salary. So this is a little boy whose life at 7 was on a very different trajectory until, as a 17-year-old, he's now socially isolated and alone. So if you look at SAR's outcomes over time, internalizing, he's kind of, right within a standard deviation of his male peers at all waves. But you see here tremendous movement around his externalizing problems ticking up with time. He's half a standard deviation above the male peers in the study by time 3, and his adaptive and prosocial behaviors plummeting, so he's half a standard deviation below his male peers at time 3. And you can see that in SAR's story. And it's young people like SAR who made us realize that just doing observational research was not what we wanted to do, that there was a major gap in terms of intervention, and that we had to think about how we could contribute. And there were a lot of wonderful programs going on to address PTSD, but not really thinking about these more complex issues of youth development over time, and that could sort of help blend with life opportunities. And so from our findings in the longitudinal study, we see that the poor outcomes in youth are greatest in those with this accumulation of war-related and post-conflict risk factors, and that there's some specificity, that certain war experiences have this kind of toxic nature. So sexual violence is associated with depression, anxiety over time, participation in injuring and killing others associated with hostility, deficits, and interpersonal and prosocial behavior, and death of a caregiver, which is another paper I didn't put up here, associated with depression and anxiety over time. But there's a lot about the post-conflict environment that matters. Stigma, tremendously influential on young people's outcomes. Poor school access, not being able to access school. Coming back to multiple daily hardships, and not having guidance, not having social support. And when you have this sort of toxic mix of risk factors and these deficits, that it impedes school and social role functioning. It's these young people who, when given a free educational opportunity or a work program, really aren't going to be able to make it. And I'll tell you a little bit about what those programs look like in Sierra Leone today. And this is what brought us to the next phase of the work. So this is one of those kind of opportunities a young person might get in post-conflict Sierra Leone. This is a picture of a typical school day at Educade, which is a wonderful NGO that we partnered with in Port Loko, Sierra Leone. They're like Montessori for big kids. These are out-of-school youth who are living in poverty, and they're working in small tutorial groups on the national curriculum. They sit for the national exams, and there are roving teachers moving around the room who have topic expertise and are working in the small groups with them. Now, Educade is free, but it does require these fees: excellent attendance, excellent behavior, and excellent effort. So when we see what we learned about what gets kids into trouble, especially those problems with emotion dysregulation, those impairments interpersonally, problems in daily functioning, how are kids like SAR, and there are many girls in our sample who have similar profiles, how are they going to pay these fees? And this is where we get to the development agenda and building towards a more productive and peaceful future in Sierra Leone. So this brought us to the need for readiness. And we've learned a lot about communicating with policymakers about mental health. We've learned quite quickly when you go to the Minister of Labor and talk about mental health, their eyes glaze over. But if you talk about readiness to learn, readiness to participate in employment programs, you're in a very different space. The World Bank actually has become a tremendously important partner for us. Before the Ebola outbreak, they had financed $20 million in youth employment programs for Sierra Leone. Now, the way those were rolled out were a little questionable. They were buildings that said youth employment centers, and they sat away from the slums, and they had nice desks and computers, but no one showed up. We now are talking with them about their next financing, which is going to be for $15 million, and we're really able to get some traction because they want to do better too. They don't like it when their programs fail and don't really transform the lives of young people. And youth are a priority for the development agenda. If you look at the agenda for prosperity for Sierra Leone, it's full of youth issues, youth employment as a target. But there are large subgroups of young people who, like SAR, are not going to be able to maximize those opportunities unless we think about what's the piece of this that comes from trauma, loss, mental health. And that's where we got into intervention development. And it's really those more troubled youth who need these opportunities the most to get back into school, to get a job, to get their lives back on track. But how are we going to do that? So we got a grant from the Harvard Catalyst, and that allowed us to work with some amazing people like John Wise, who literally wrote the book on evidence-based psychotherapy for children and adolescents, and some of his collaborators like Sarah Kate Behrman. We also worked with Ann Wilhoit from CVT to look at what are elements of of effective programs for young people affected by complex trauma in different settings, maybe diverse cultural settings, that are transportable to this very low resource setting of Sierra Leone. What might work here? And what is the context in which we're going to try to do this intervention? And who are the right interveners for this to truly be sustainable? So this brought us back to our mixed method self. And so we went out in 2010 and talked to local stakeholders. We did focus groups with war-affected youth, with elders in the community. We talked to stakeholders in the government who are working on youth programs. So we talked to mental health professionals, the few who are in the country. We talked to religious leaders, community leaders, youth leaders. And we established a community advisory board with young people, with some of these stakeholders on it, to start to review what we were doing. And this resulted in the very beginning of the intervention itself. Now, some of the contextual realities our formative research indicated we had to contend with included limited human resources. Sierra Leone is a country of 6 million people with one quasi-retired psychiatrist for the whole country, post-conflict and Ebola affected. They have now trained a handful of psychiatric nurses, but they're based at hospitals. And Sierra Leone has an infamous mental hospital. I think it's the oldest one in sub-Saharan Africa, called Kissi Mental Hospital, where it's a death sentence to go there. Mental health is tremendously stigmatized because everyone knows what happens to you when you go to Kissi. You're going to be chained to a bed in rags and your own excrement, and you'll be lucky if people bring you food. And your family's going to have to do that if you want food. So these are really challenging issues around how do we overcome the lack of a mental health system in Sierra Leone. So we had to think about a model that could be delivered by task shifting, task sharing, training local health workers to do the implementation. And then what was that going to require in terms of training and supervision? And we had to think about group work. And group work fits the collectivist culture more. We just can't afford the individual models to think about going to scale. It's not to say they don't matter, and there is great work going on that also involves individual mental health counseling. But we decided to focus on a group model. Also, as I mentioned, you have to contend with the reality of comorbidity and complex trauma. That these are young people who've had many forms of loss and trauma in their lives, and they don't present with just a clean disorder, just depression or just traumatic stress reactions. We have to think about transdiagnostic interventions that can sort of move across those domains of problems and functional impairments. And then also we couldn't just do standalone mental health. We had to think about linking to life opportunities for employment and for education. And how could we set up a model like that? So this is our theory of change, and these are the intervention components that we settled on. It has sort of 3 phases that you'll commonly see in trauma-informed interventions: a phase focused on stabilization, on integration of skills, and on connection to others. We have 6 common evidence-based practices that you'll see largely in CBT, but also this was somewhat inspired by my experience in working on IPT, interpersonal therapy for war-affected youth in northern Uganda. So one of the important components that you see in a lot of interventions is psychoeducation on trauma and its effects on your sense of yourself and your relationships with others. Also emotion regulation, that we have problems with emotion dysregulation. So what are the skills to realize when you're being triggered or might be triggered? How can you take action to engage in self-regulation or relaxation skills? What are those that work for you? And I'll show you an example of how we communicate that. And then cognitive restructuring, sort of challenging those negative self-perceptions and negative perceptions of the world. Behavioral activation, which has a very strong evidence base, especially for the treatment of depression-like problems. Just staying busy and being in contact with other people, something that SAR didn't have access to. And communication and interpersonal skills in this last phase. Once we sort of build up those basic coping skills, then how do you put your best self forward? How do you communicate well with others when you're in a conflict? How do you set manageable goals and work towards them in sequential problem solving? And these are the 6 components that we decided lay workers could do, and that we could train and supervise people to do that. You don't see trauma processing here in groups. This is a phase 1, stabilization and skills focused intervention. And Judy Herman, who spoke to you earlier, actually helped us really think through what's going to be feasible, what's appropriate here. For people needing a higher level of care, there are other services, especially focused around PTSD. We are not trying to treat PTSD with an intervention like this. We're trying to raise up all boats, and we're trying to help young people connect to life opportunities. So these treatment components have a robust evidence base in terms of effectiveness in the US and in the UK, but we really don't know a lot about how they work in low and middle income countries, especially war-affected regions. Another part that we had to think about is the role of culture. I'm fortunate that we have a tremendous local team, and I have someone like Adeyinka Akinsolori-Smith to collaborate with. But we had to think about the fact that the young people we're working with aren't very literate. And we can't have fancy homework. We can't have fancy, verbally dense manuals. We have to think, how are we able to communicate the basics of what this intervention is about in ways that young people can connect to? And so we did, through our community advisory board and our stakeholder interviews, talked with people about metaphors, about sayings, about proverbs that could help young people understand what the content of the intervention in each session was about. And so we sort of structure this around a range of different proverbs and sayings that are well known in the Creole language. One of my favorites, because people talk about idioms of distress, and sometimes that word's bandied about and not used very accurately, but it's really about a way of saying something that it can't be literally translated, that there's meaning much deeper than a literal translation. My favorite here, I don't know if anyone here has been to Sierra Leone or speaks Creole, if you take tem ke ant, you go see him gut, which when you translate that, it means if you take time when killing an ant, you get to see its guts. Like, why would you want to do that? But in Creole, that means if you stay focused, you'll achieve your goal. You're going to get there if you keep your focus. And young people could really understand, when we would bring these proverbs forward, what the session was about. We also do a lot of community outreach. When we did the early intervention study, all the space we used for these groups was donated by the community. We'd go to a village elder, maybe he had a compound and he had a private room that was able to be used for the groups, or a school that wasn't in session on the weekend. And so it's very important that we reach out to the community to set up interventions like this so they can reach young people where they live. This is about community outreach. And then I mentioned emotion regulation and trying to communicate in metaphors. And so if you look in a lot of CBT manuals about emotion dysregulation, and they talk about things like a train speeding out of control, or a television turned up too loud. Well, those aren't metaphors that are going to fly in Sierra Leone. But what we landed on was talking about a pot of water coming to a boil. It doesn't just go from cool to a raging boil. It starts to heat and percolate, and little bubbles start to show that you too can tell when you're being triggered and you're starting to bubble and start to heat up. And how can you then use some of the coping skills to step in? And these are very popular. We found that things like progressive muscle relaxation went over quite badly. People don't have a clean, comfortable place to sit to do that kind of work. Laying on the floor isn't a good idea. But they love the belly blow, the deep breathing. Love it. And our intervention staff would use it, and they'd come back and talk about how deep breathing was changing their lives when they got stressed. And so it's been very interesting to see what goes over well and what people link onto. An important part of our work is capacity building, making partnerships with locals. As I mentioned, throughout all these forms of adversity in Sierra Leone, they've been amazing people trained by NGOs to do mental health work, but not really absorbed into any sort of system. So this is a picture of Jim and Alamami, two of our expert trainers who worked with CAPS. Ooh, 5 minutes. Whoa, okay. And we engage these people as our expert trainers and supervisors as we go on to implement intervention. When we do the clinical training, it's important that it's in the local language. We run the whole thing like a role play. Everyone works through the whole treatment model, running the group and taking turns, some of us being the role players and some of us being the interventionists, and use local examples. The girls' groups are divided by age, so you've got older girls, younger girls, the kind of issues that come up are different. Same for the boys, younger boys, older boys, and I'll show you a bit about the study we did of the intervention model. So we had our randomized control trial launched in 2012 in the western area of Sierra Leone. We enrolled 436 youth into this study. From the longitudinal study, we could set inclusion criteria. We knew what the average sort of level of overall distress was in that already elevated sample. So we set the inclusion criteria to be half a standard deviation above that sample mean and have some impairment in day-to-day functioning, because functional impairments are so important when it comes to carrying out your work responsibilities or being able to attend school. And young people in this study had to be school intending, because what we were doing was looking at readiness to then go on to a life opportunity. We used the UN definition of youth, ages 15 to 24, and stratified by male, female, and by age. So in a place like Sierra Leone in the community, with help from village leaders, we were able to get about 761 youth referred using local terms like poil at, like torment, frustrate, these kind of problems that people relate to that describe mental health problems or emotion dysregulation problems. We then screen them using tablets. We were able to randomize 436 youth to intervention where they'd get readiness or be in a waitlist control, and then everybody went on to the Educate program after that. The implementation was 10 weeks. The sessions were weekly. We had a hot meal to make it appealing for young people to come, about 90-minute sessions. They were delivered by lay workers who got this 2-week intensive training. And we really emphasized supervision. Supervision is this unaddressed issue in global mental health, bless you. We can't just train people and then turn them over like what happened with the child welfare committees. We have to think about robust models to talk about how are your cases going? How are your groups going? What's going well? What's not? Let's problem solve. Let's come with a plan for your next session. And we do that in groups in country, and then we did supervision by phone as well. In terms of our outcomes, we're looking at a lot of those same things from the intergenerational study, but also especially the mechanisms of emotion dysregulation using the DERS scale, prosocial attitudes and behaviors, overall psychological distress, social support, and daily functioning. And then we did exit interviews with the interveners looking at satisfaction as well. So this is our study sample at baseline. You see here about, in the treatment group, 222, 214 in the control group. One thing to note here, look at the level of war exposures in this sample. This is, years and years after the war. This is 2012. And you still have a very high rate separated from caregivers due to war, who'd had a friend or family member die in the war, exposure directly to armed conflict, and even 6% of our sample, and that's just being referred because of symptoms and impairment. 6% were formerly with an armed group. And we see they're very comparable in terms of our outcomes at baseline. Now here's our intervention impact. When we look at pre to post intervention, comparing the control group to the intervention group, we see significant improvement in emotion regulation, effect size of about 0.31, prosocial behavior, effect size 0.38, functional impairment, which actually in our Northern Uganda study, we had no impact on daily functioning, but here we actually got some traction around daily functioning, effect size of 0.35. Psychological distress, we only saw effects for those who were in the upper quartile of distress, but we did see an effect on social support of about 0.26. Now, when we look at 6 months out, a lot of the effects wash out over time, except for those who had the highest level of deficits in social support and those who were most challenged by emotion dysregulation. There are still some effects 6 months out. But what's also exciting is what happened when they went to the school program. And so we found that at 8-month follow-up, youth who had gotten the youth readiness intervention were actually 6 times more likely to persist in school than those who had just gone straight into the school program. Now, overall school enrollment wasn't that high, but that's something really exciting, and that's, again, about that functioning. And we had been able to enroll teachers in the study. They didn't know who got the intervention and who was in the control group. And their reports also showed an independent effect of better classroom behavior, better attitude, better preparedness for those who got the readiness intervention. So this was very exciting to then start to think about, can it work beyond the education sector? This is a quote from a 16-year-old girl in one of our groups. I didn't know how to interact with people. I was so aggressive. But since I went through the intervention, my life has changed. And the qualitative data really triangulates a lot of the quantitative finding in this study. So this brought us to thinking about translation of our findings in policy action. And we were part of the task force that advanced the mental health policy and strategic plan that got implemented in 2012. And we realized that there are huge limitations in how we can get these kinds of services to youth. And we need to do more research. This is one teeny little study. Will it replicate? What if we take it to other settings? But because of this link to human capital and functioning, the development actors started to get really interested. And the World Bank, which has been galvanized by Jim Heckman's work on early childhood development and non-cognitive skills, as they call them, which to psychologists is a bit bizarre because everything about interpersonal skills is about the brain. It's not non-cognitive. But this is taken off at the bank. People want to figure out how to do it. And this led to this really neat collaboration with the World Bank, where now in their next round of youth employment funding, there's going to be a bid for youth-serving employment agencies to also have an evidence-based mental health component. And this allowed us to then write the grant for the Youth Forward Hub. And so this is a grant from the National National Institutes of Mental Health on alternate delivery platforms for implementation of evidence-based behavioral interventions and taking them to scale for youth facing adversity. Our focus is on West Africa. We have a capacity building, research capacity building element, but also a scale-up study, and I'll show you a little bit on that. It's a partnership with the universities, with key development actors, and with the government and NGOs to advance our understanding of evidence-based mental health services for young people exposed to many adversities, including war, but also Ebola. So this is a scale-up study, and what we'll be doing in this, now it's a much bigger sample size, we'll be targeting across 24 youth-serving agencies. So we'll replicate the sort of waitlist control model we did with the education program to see if we get the same impact on attitudes, participation in the employment program, in addition to the symptoms and functioning. But what we're also testing here is an implementation science approach. And so of those 24 sites, half of them are going to be randomized to getting something called an interagency collaborative team. And this is coming from the work of Greg Ahrens, who in the state of California was involved in studying the scale-up of the Safe Care intervention. I don't know if you guys have Safe Care out here. It's basically a family home visiting model for child protection advancement. But they were able to take that evidence-based practice to scale by setting up these seed teams across the agencies. Because what happens is you get your expert trainer and then they leave and all the knowledge goes with them. But what we'll be testing here is what happens when you bring the agencies into a learning collaborative, those cross-site learning and communication, can it sustain high-quality practices? Our intergenerational study continues. This is a JAMA commentary I just wrote about the impact of thinking intergenerationally. Hopefully you'll have me back someday to tell you about those findings, because we're still collecting them. But just to wrap up, I hope I've been able to argue to you that attention to mental health of youth and adversity is critical to advancing development and advancing peace in war-affected settings. That evidence-based interventions are feasible, they're possible in these very poor countries, but we have to start getting out of the box and thinking creatively about those opportunities to getting these services to young people. And that may mean alternate delivery platforms, such as education programs, employment programs, poverty reduction programs. And the big questions for all of us going forward, and I was talking to some of you about the work that's going on here in your different degree programs, how exciting to start thinking about the issues of how do we sustain these things? What are the costs? What are the business management principles? How do we take them to scale? Because it's one thing to think about neat models that might work, but if they don't go to scale and reach these young people, and if the government can't afford them and sustain them, it doesn't matter. You know, so it's all about building local capacity, and with that, I hope we can arrive at some form of sustainability and system improvement in low-resource settings. So with that, I'll wrap up, and thank you.
You made a comment I'm very interested in about supervision, and I'm wondering, besides what I think is the obvious reason about cost, what are the other reasons you've experienced or come to believe are the result then in very little supervision and a lot of different types of modalities? I'm looking particularly at home visitation, but in general.
Yeah, I think it's such a critical issue in global mental health. And I think there just hasn't been a culture of what all of us who get any clinical training think of as clinical supervision. So when you're in a job, like many of these NGO jobs, you have a supervisor. But they're going to check that you showed up, they'll maybe sign your paycheck, they'll say if you're a good employee or not. But in terms of how is it going, how are you managing your caseload, what's going well, how can we help you, there's just not that sort of culture of thinking in that way about the very sensitive work people are doing. And people are hungry for it. You know, they're burning out. When I worked in northern Uganda, I saw some frightening practices in those interim care centers for former child soldiers, because once you get that job, and once the psychologist from New York comes and gives you a flip chart training about psychosocial issues and they leave, you're not going to leave that job. You know, there's so few jobs out there, and if you get stressed and burned out and start abusing and neglecting kids, there's really no one to keep tabs on that. So I saw these like treatment groups where it's like 50 children sitting in chairs, and they'd ask them to share their trauma in front of all the other 50 kids, raise their hand, and they'd tell them to pray. They'd move on to the next kids. They were chaining kids up. You know, they're just, people don't know that there's the possibility to get support to do these very stressful jobs. And I think those of us who've been involved in capacity building haven't done a great job in getting that message out there, that it's not just training. It's really about professional development and supervision, and that's how we're going to get to quality. And once people get it, they're so grateful for it because they're burning out. These are very difficult situations to work in, and most of the people who are providers went through the same experience. They've been through trauma, they've lost members of their family, they've seen horrible things. So I think going forward, there's more and more attention to it. But models and really studying models to do it and studying what you get when you try different models of training and supervision is a kind of new area of implementation science and global mental health, and it's a really important one.
Boku Tenki, I have such a, I was having flashbacks to Sierra Leone with so much warmth and love for that. I'm curious, did you have measures of the community, measure of the change in community narrative about child soldiers? Because the outcomes to see people's both sort of sense of self as well as their behaviors change as a result of these interventions is wonderful. And I always wonder, does that then change how others think of them? I was in Sierra Leone very briefly for the Ebola response, and one of the issues we saw at play was that stigma around the burial teams actually reused some of the narrative from the Civil War and, you know, opinions about the burial teams that you couldn't do this work if you weren't a child soldier and already like damaged yourself. So I'm just curious if that's a marker that you're measuring in any way.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So the Ebola link is very interesting because it's played out a lot of the same dynamics, and this issue of stigma is tremendously important. We actually, our staff couldn't work on the intergenerational study of war during Ebola. The NIH actually got really concerned about could we study, could we keep things going? And so we had a period where our staff were all going to lose their jobs if we suspended the study. And we got some funding through some Harvard philanthropists to actually take our amazing staff who are gifted at quant interviews, and while we had to put the NIH work on pause, we did a study of the social context of Ebola. So we actually have a paper in PLOS Medicine that looks at people's past war traumas and how that relates to risky behaviors related to Ebola prevention or risk behaviors that could spread the disease. And we found, especially for people, people who already had anxiety were actually good at being more vigilant and avoiding risky situations. But people who were depressed were at greater risk in terms of engaging in risky behavior. So again, you have to address mental health if you're going to deal with overall human health. It's a part of human health. And we actually have 3 waves of data. We're looking at an analysis now of stigma towards Ebola survivors. I don't know if we did a good job putting a question about people. We have questions about people who worked with people with Ebola, but not burial teams per se. But I think it will be, if you have ideas for this, actually, like what are the things you'd want us to really look at, I'd be all ears because it's an opportunity to explore that in the data. But definitely these dynamics got recreated, right? We've been careful about the child soldiers issue and how we work in Sierra Leone because I do think it's a bit of a red herring. There were ways in which at the end of the war, there were these sort of label-driven services all the time, which I think it's an attempt to deal with limited resources, right? So this program's just for gender-based violence survivors, and this program's just for child soldiers. But when you fund in that way, you do nothing good to strengthen sustainable systems of care. And so someone's got to have a label to get that service. And we see it in HIV too. Rather than investing in mental health and social services for anyone who needs it due to symptoms and impairment. So in thinking about Ebola survivors and thinking about former child soldiers, these issues of stigma still persist, and it's because there have been this kind of labels, and people sometimes the labels have utility. When we did the qualitative work that was the formative work to do the intervention study, we didn't want to in any way interact with our longitudinal sample to get child soldiers to talk with about the present post-conflict environment. So we wanted a new cohort to do the focus groups. And so we asked, where can we find some former child soldiers that we could talk to? We asked local people, and they said, we were looking for girls. Where could we speak with some female former child soldiers? They said, oh, go down to where the prostitutes are. Go down to the fish docks where all the prostitutes. So there's just equal sign between someone with that label and this highly, stigmatized population. And because Sierra Leone had that experience of doing sensitization campaigns, we've been advocating again for this real need to reinvigorate that because stigma is extremely damning. And we know it's one of the biggest predictors of kids not thriving in our longitudinal sample, and probably for Ebola survivors and those who help them, it's going to be a persistent issue.
So,
Yeah,
hi. One of the things that we've been looking at, thank you for your presentation, this is really exciting for me. One of the things we've been looking at in the conference is how do we interweave mental health with peace building practices. And Sierra Leone presents a really interesting opportunity because of the Fumble Talk. Do you know the Fumble Talk?
Fumble Talk. Yeah.
Fumble Talk. So these grassroots
Yep.
efforts where they're doing reintegration of adults, not necessarily child soldiers.
Yep.
And so I'm wondering, is there a way in your evaluation to look at whether the communities that have participated in Fumble Talk are actually better situated in terms of their destigmatization, their readiness for integration,
Right.
and if so, or if not, how might we, because that process continues,
Yeah.
how might we shift or remodel the core of that component so that
Right.
it would be preparing those communities more effectively for the reintegration?
Yeah. No, Fumble Talk is a great program. And so when I talked about those sensitization campaigns, for those who don't know it, it just means, it's like family talk, but it means coming together as a community. Fumble is used up broadly sometimes to talk about community too, to talk about acceptance and coexistence. Just like I have a problem in my study that I can't take the interim care center kids and compare them to the self-reintegrated kids as any way of having inference about the effects of the interim care centers because there's selection bias going on, right? So a kid landed in the interim care center usually because they didn't have any family anyone could find and they couldn't sneak home, right? So it's a sort of, if we were to try to say, oh, look at the kids in this way are different, and that must mean the program worked or didn't, it gets a little shaky. And I think with Fumble Talk now there's selection going on too, like why some places were able to carry it out and some places couldn't carry it out. But so from a design perspective, I think there would be other designs you might want to pursue or think about. And I wonder with Ebola, actually. Ebola would be you could actually look at some areas that have a similar level of Ebola impact and randomly, work on a community-based stigma, focused intervention in those communities compared to comparison communities that don't get it yet, and actually have a design that's robust. I think that would be amazing. And it would tell you a lot about sensitization because as you brought up in your question, the dynamics of stigma from the war to the Ebola outbreak are pretty similar. So I think a study like that would be really important. We haven't been able to do something like that. So I'd love to see you guys do that work.
First, thank you for sharing this. It's been really exciting for me to see this work, particularly because I'm in the midst of an assessment for Eritrean refugee youth living in camp settings in Ethiopia. And your work has been incredibly useful for our team in kind of initially setting up the steps of how we want to conduct this and what we want to look at. Creating our interview guides and things like that, particularly the work that you did in the same area, finding the significant mediating role of caregiver mental health on children.
Yep.
So even that work, before I'd even seen this, is really impacting and changing the way that we are trying to approach this creatively.
Yeah.
Because what we're seeing is there's a greater risk. What we're specifically looking for and looking at in this population is the increased risk of self-harm and suicide. It's been happening over the last year and a half.
Is it Kunama refugees like the study we did or a different population?
No, it's not specifically that population. Particularly unaccompanied refugee youth. We're seeing this as a highest risk. Makes sense, particularly given the collective nature of the society and the cultures that they come from and that they're currently living in. So I guess what I'm wondering now after seeing this is the idea that the pilot you've done here, I'm wondering the role of family support and if that had any factor on it, particularly given the idea that some of these children maybe weren't able to reintegrate into a family setting. And then in your scale up initiatives, which I'm very excited to see where that goes and how that works out. Are you looking at communities that maybe have a large population of unsupervised or unaccompanied youth that don't have that family support system, and how you feel like that might impact the work there?
Yeah, no, that's really important work you're doing. I'm excited to hear about it. In so much of my work, it's why you see that I have 3 big, things we're working on right now, and 2 of them are family-based prevention, because everything we've learned about, young people having attachment relationships, and that sort of going back to Bronfenbrenner, having one person who's just dedicated to you, and how critical that is for your, and it can be anybody in so many ways, but how critical that is, and when kids don't have that, how much they're at risk for a range of negative life outcomes. And also thinking from a prevention perspective. The other study I want to do, if people here who, are out there doing work on post-conflict situations, my dream study is a child soldiers reintegration study where we, again, in a robust design, take a model like Colombia right now. I've been talking to a few people. I just don't have the ability to do yet another study, but I'd love to see somebody do this study where they've already got a pretty thoughtful model. The Colombia Child Soldiers Reintegration Project addresses issues of access to medical care, education. It looks at the family environment, and it has an economic support element. And we use this model that we call SAFE. That's about the basic do not forgets of children's basic security needs: safety, access to physiological needs, medical care, family and connection to others, economic security, education. The Columbia model does a good job, but the family part is pretty weak. They have a family home visitor, but it's, again, kind of light. It's not really close work with the family dynamics, preparation that this child's been through violence and trauma. You've been through violence, trauma, and loss. What can you anticipate? What will be your coping skills? How's it going once it happens? Staying with them. No one's doing that yet in any child soldiers research. We just keep plopping them in integration centers and then getting them home and doing some light checking in, and we're out of there. So I'd love to see a proper randomized trial of family-based intervention for reintegration. And I think for unaccompanied minors, a big part is connecting them back to some sort of a family environment, that those are young people who are disconnected from attachment figures, and those can be reformulated in so many ways. And I think in Sierra Leone with the groups, these are young people, a lot of them did grow up separated from caregivers. You saw that in the baseline data. But in the group, they're able to reformulate connections, and they're also able to have healthier navigation of those attachment relationships they do have by coming to the group for problem solving. So some of the young people in our group had problems with an auntie or an uncle they were living with, and they could use the group to problem solve around how to navigate that relationship. So for young people who don't have family, but maybe they're in a placement setting, groups to help them problem solve on how to maintain those healthy relationships are critical. But if at all possible, always getting young people home to a committed, connected family environment of any form, and then supporting it like crazy, I think is something we're not doing enough work on when it comes to war-affected populations. Yeah.
Thank you for the amazing presentation and thoughtful.